What if I told you that some of the most comforting dishes in American history were created not out of abundance, but out of desperation? During the Great Depression, when there were bare cupboards and pennies counted, families did not just make do. They created food that warmed the soul and united a community. Center to it was church kitchens, where simple ingredients and collective wisdom translated hardships into traditions. Here in this video, we are revealing 25 unforgettable church recipes from the Great Depression, so humble yet so potent that they sustained body and soul through America's bleakest moments. Hang in there, because you could just discover that these recipes aren't antiques. They're just what we're in need of today. Poor man's steak. Poor man's steak wasn't just a recipe, it was a lifeline. Born from necessity during a time when real steak was a luxury few could afford, this clever creation turned modest pantry staples into something that felt hearty, filling, and even a little indulgent. It started with ground beef, cheap, accessible, and easy to stretch. Cracker crumbs or oatmeal bulked it out, giving it structure. Once shaped into patties that looked like steak, they were dredged in flour and browned in a skillet until golden and crisp on the outside. But the real magic happened next. A simple gravy, made from pan drippings, flour, and milk, transformed it into something far greater than the sum of its parts. You'd find this dish bubbling away in church basements before a Sunday potluck, or served on chipped plates around crowded kitchen tables where laughter and hardship sat side by side. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, even included a version in their 1933 community cookbook, proof of how cherished it had become. With just a single pound of beef, families could feed 6 hungry mouths, especially when paired with a mountain of mashed potatoes to soak up every last drop of gravy. It was humble, yes, but it tasted like dignity, like hope, like a mother doing her best to bring joy to the dinner table even when the cupboard was nearly bare. Today, when we recreate poor man's steak, it's not just about nostalgia. It's about honoring the creativity and courage of a generation that found ways to turn struggle into comfort, one skillet at a time. Potato soup. Potato soup wasn't just dinner during the Great Depression. It was hope in a bowl. In small-town America, when winters were long and wallets were light, there was something almost sacred about the smell of potatoes simmering on the stove. Church basements would come alive with the earthy scent, pulling neighbors in from the cold like a promise. You'll be fed tonight. Meat was rare. Fresh produce is even rarer. But the potato, humble, hearty, and always dependable, became the unsung hero of countless kitchens. It was dug from frozen soil or hauled in from a root cellar, scrubbed clean, and stretched into sustenance. The recipe? Nothing fancy. Just chopped potatoes, a handful of onions, water, or milk if you were lucky, a knob of butter if it hadn't gone rancid, and salt and pepper scraped from nearly empty tins. Yet in the hands of a church cook or a tired mother with 6 mouths to feed, it transformed into something greater. Something comforting, something enough. Big metal pots would bubble away during fellowship suppers, especially in the Midwest, where blizzards closed roads but never stopped the soup from being served. A 1932 recipe from the Methodist Women's Auxiliary in Minnesota proudly claimed a single pot could feed 12 hungry souls for under $1. And they weren't lying. People got creative. Wild onions were foraged from empty fields. Ham bones saved from Sunday dinners were boiled down for flavor. Even potato peels, normally tossed aside, were added for extra bulk. Some thickened it with flour when milk ran dry. Every family had their version, and every version tasted like survival. Today, our bowls are richer. We ladle in cream. We top it with shredded cheese, crisp bacon, and chives. But those things are modern luxuries layered on a meal that came from a much deeper place. Because potato soup is more than just food. It's a story, a memory, a quiet act of resistance against hunger and hardship. and every warm spoonful whispers the same truth. When we have little, we make do. When we have each other, we thrive. Water pie. It sounds like a punchline, doesn't it? A dessert made with water as its main ingredient? But during the Great Depression, it wasn't a joke, it was a miracle. In church kitchens across the South, when pantries were nearly empty and dessert seemed like a distant dream, someone dared to believe that even water could be turned into something sweet. Born out of Southern church communities, this unlikely pie became a staple at bake sales and Sunday potlucks. The First Presbyterian Church of Memphis recorded one of the earliest versions in their 1931 fundraising cookbook. The recipe? A humble pastry crust filled with nothing more than water, sugar, flour, butter, and a touch of vanilla extract. But here's where the magic happens. In the oven, these modest ingredients transform into a silky, custard-like filling with a light, nostalgic sweetness that caught everyone by surprise. One minister's wife in Oklahoma became famous for it, baking 6 water pies for every church event, feeding dozens of people for just pennies a slice. It wasn't flashy, but it was enough. Enough to bring smiles to weary faces and a moment of indulgence when indulgence was rare. People didn't eat water pie because it was trendy. They ate it because it was a triumph. A dessert that came not from wealth, but from willpower. It reminded families that even when money was gone, joy didn't have to be. And today, as more people rediscover this Depression-era treasure, it stands as a delicious reminder. Sometimes, the most powerful recipes are born from nothing, but mean everything. Dandelion salad. Picture this. It's early spring. The snow has melted, but the ground still carries the chill of a long winter. The pantry is nearly bare. The root cellar echoes. And dinner? It'll depend on what's sprouting outside your door. That's the reality countless American families faced during the Great Depression. In those lean, uncertain months, when even a trip to the market was out of reach, survival meant turning to the land, and sometimes to the weeds underfoot. Enter the dandelion. That sunny little plant most of us wage war on today was once a lifeline. Back then, dandelion salad wasn't a novelty. It was nourishment, medicine, and in many ways, a quiet triumph. In tight-knit towns, especially across Pennsylvania Dutch country, foraging wasn't just necessity, it was a shared ritual. Church groups like the Lutheran Ladies' Aid Society organized outings, teaching members not only how to find the greens before the golden blossoms burst open, but how to respect the earth while doing it. Their 1934 church cookbook included handwritten notes. Best picked before bloom. Tenderest, then. Add vinegar if bitter. Mothers would send their children out with baskets and careful instructions. Pick the young ones, they'd say. No flowers. Watch for ants. And so, barefoot kids combed the fields, learning early that food didn't always come from a store. It came from paying attention. Back in the kitchen, the magic happened with whatever was on hand. A drizzle of warm bacon grease, a splash of vinegar, maybe a pinch of sugar or a chopped hard-boiled egg if someone had chickens. It was fresh, tangy, earthy. And after a long winter of boiled potatoes and dry beans, it tasted like life itself. More than just a salad, it was a reminder that even in the hardest times, beauty and sustenance could still be found growing wild. It taught a generation how to honor what they had, even if it was just a handful of greens. Vinegar pie. Imagine craving apple pie, but having no apples. No orchard, no farmer's market, no can of fruit tucked away in the cupboard. That was the everyday reality for millions of American families during the Great Depression. Fruit was a luxury, seasonal, expensive, and often out of reach. But out of that scarcity came one of the most unexpectedly brilliant desserts of the era. Vinegar pie. Yes, vinegar. It doesn't sound like the stuff of comfort food, But in the hands of a resourceful home cook or a church lady preparing for the Sunday bake sale, a splash of vinegar transformed humble ingredients into something that could rival even the finest slice of apple pie. Vinegar pie was an act of culinary creativity wrapped in a golden crust. With no apples to be found, bakers leaned on what they did have: sugar, eggs, flour, a bit of butter, and just enough vinegar to mimic the tart snap of green apples or fresh lemon. Add a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg, and the result was a smooth, sweet-tangy custard that tasted far richer than its origins. The First Methodist Church of Springfield, Illinois, called it a pie for when the apple barrel is empty in their 1930 community cookbook, and it quickly became a staple at church socials, funeral luncheons, and winter bake sales all across the country. Women's auxiliaries loved it because it was cheap to make, easy to store, and, perhaps most importantly, impossible to keep on the table. It always sold out first. This wasn't just dessert. It was dessert with a backbone. A reminder that even in your hardest season, you could still offer your neighbors a slice of sweetness. And there was practicality in every bite. No apples meant no need for canning, no refrigeration required. Vinegar pie kept well for days on the counter, waiting patiently to lift spirits after supper or surprise guests who dropped by for coffee and conversation. This is a recipe that whispered, "We may not have much, but we still have something to share." Hoover Stew. Hoover Stew, just hearing the name, leaves a trace of bitterness. Not from the taste, but from the times it represents. Named with biting irony after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the crash that sent millions spiraling into poverty, Hoover Stew wasn't a recipe born from a cookbook. It was born from necessity, from hunger, and from a nation trying to keep its people fed when the pantry was as empty as their pockets. Imagine it, a long line wrapping around the block, made up of men in worn-out coats and mothers holding tired, hungry children. Inside the church basement, the air was thick with the scent of something warm, bubbling on the stove. Not much, but something. A pot of Hoover Stew simmering over a blue gas flame, its ingredients cobbled together from donations, leftovers, and ingenuity. No one asked for seconds out of greed. They were just grateful for a hot meal that night. In 1932, the Salvation Army helped make Hoover Stew a staple, serving their version in shelters and soup lines across the country. The recipe was a marvel of frugality. Sliced hot dogs stretched far beyond their size, elbow macaroni to fill hungry bellies, canned tomatoes to bring some tang and warmth, chopped onions for flavor, and if the pantry was lucky that week, a spoonful of canned corn or beans. In Detroit, the First Baptist Church served Hoover Stew twice a week in 1933, ladling out over 15,000 meals in a single winter to unemployed auto workers and their families. And every bowl wasn't just calories, it was care. It was proof that someone still saw you, that someone still believed you were worth feeding. The beauty of Hoover Stew wasn't just in its simplicity, it was in its adaptability. No hot dogs on hand? Use leftover beans. Whatever ingredients the congregation could gather, they went into the pot. And around that bubbling stew, something else always formed: community. Hoover Stew was never meant to be a culinary masterpiece, but in the darkest days of the Depression, it became a symbol of resilience and neighborly love. A dish stirred not just with spoons, but with compassion. Wacky Cake. Imagine trying to bake a chocolate cake, but you've got no eggs, no milk, and no butter. Sounds like a lost cause, right? But back in the days of the Great Depression, when cupboards were sparse and luxuries were things you only dreamed about, American families didn't give up. They got creative. Out of that creativity, and maybe a bit of desperation, came one of the most unexpectedly delightful desserts of the era: Wacky Cake, also lovingly known as Crazy Cake or Depression Cake. It was a miracle made from next to nothing. Church kitchens across the country embraced it almost immediately. One of the earliest recorded versions came from the Women's Auxiliary of Grace Episcopal Church in Cleveland, printed in a humble 1933 fundraising cookbook. The recipe spread fast because it was brilliant in its simplicity and kind to every budget. No eggs, no dairy, no mixer, just flour, cocoa powder, sugar, vinegar, baking soda, vegetable oil, and water. That's it. And the real magic? You mixed it right in the baking pan. No bowls, no fancy tools, fewer dishes to scrub when even soap had to be rationed. Mothers made it for birthdays when there wasn't much else to celebrate. Sunday school teachers brought it to class, and it vanished before you could say grace. It was dark, rich, and impossibly moist for a cake with no real ingredients. Kids didn't know the difference. Grown-ups were quietly impressed, and everyone walked away with a little more joy than they had going in. Even now, Wacky Cake holds its own, praised for being dairy-free, egg-free, vegan, and incredibly easy to whip up. But back then, it was much more than just a dessert. It was resilience, disguised as chocolate. A bite of sweetness in the middle of struggle. A small but powerful reminder that with a little resourcefulness and a lot of heart, something beautiful could come from very little. Ham and bean soup. Ham and bean soup wasn't just food during the Great Depression. It was comfort, community, and survival, all simmering in one big pot. In a time when dollars were scarce and meat was a luxury, this humble soup kept bellies full and spirits lifted. You could walk past almost any church basement or community hall and catch the scent of hope rising in the air. Smoky ham, soft beans, and the slow promise of something warm on the coldest of nights. One especially cherished version came from the Ladies' Aid Society of the First Christian Church in Springfield, Missouri. In their 1931 cookbook, they wrote, "A single ham bone with a little meat still clinging to it can flavor enough soup to serve 20 hungry souls." That wasn't just a recipe, it was gospel. A survival tactic passed between neighbors, shared from pulpits, and ladled into bowls without question. The ingredients were whatever could be spared: a handful of dried beans, a chopped onion, maybe some carrots or potatoes, and of course a ham bone, often saved from Sunday's dinner, stripped bare but still carrying enough flavor to infuse the entire pot. The bone didn't have to be fancy, it just had to be there. Church kitchens were the heart of it all. Volunteers stirred giant pots for hours, not just to feed people, but to bring them together. No one asked for much. No one left empty-handed. The soup filled more than stomachs. It warmed frozen hands, eased worried minds, and reminded everyone that they weren't alone in their struggle. Even long after the Depression passed, the memory of that soup remained. It became a Sunday tradition in some households, or the first thing a grandmother taught her granddaughter to cook. Not because they had to anymore, but because it meant something. Peanut butter bread. During the Great Depression, when meals were more about survival than satisfaction, one quiet loaf began showing up in church kitchens, bake sales, and lunch pails across the country. Peanut butter bread. There were no eggs. Milk was rationed or gone entirely. Meat? A rare indulgence. But peanut butter, a shelf-stable, protein-rich pantry hero, became a lifeline. And when baked into a loaf with just a few simple ingredients, it became more than food. It became comfort. In kitchens warmed by wood stoves and hope, women stirred together flour, baking powder, sugar, salt, a splash of milk, or water, if milk was too much, and a generous spoonful of peanut butter. The result was a dense, nutty sweet bread that could stretch a meal, fill a child's belly, and bring a smile to faces that hadn't seen dessert in weeks. The earliest printed recipe appeared in the 1932 Five Roses Flour cookbook, but it didn't stay there for long. It was passed from hand to hand, scribbled on note cards, whispered across pews and quilting circles. Church women in Des Moines shared their famous version, baked weekly for school lunches and fundraisers, wrapped in wax paper, and tucked into baskets bound for neighbors who had even less. At a time when hunger was a daily reality, peanut butter bread meant more than calories. It meant somebody cared. It was baked with hands that had scrubbed floors and washed threadbare clothes. Served warm with a dab of jam or cold with a cup of weak coffee, it reminded families that even in scarcity, love could still rise. Kids might not have known they were eating depression food. All they knew was that it tasted like something special, something just for them. And parents? They loved that a single loaf could do so much, stretch a budget, fill little tummies, and offer just a touch of sweetness in an otherwise bitter time. Church supper, casserole. When the Great Depression came, casseroles weren't just dinner, they were a lifesaver. In church halls across America, one dish became the hero of potlucks, prayer meetings, and Sunday suppers, the church supper casserole. It wasn't fancy, and that was the beauty of it. People used whatever they had, bits of leftover meat, canned tomatoes, chopped onions, or yesterday's vegetables. A scoop of macaroni, a handful of beans, or even stale bread could all go into the mix. What made this casserole so brilliant was its flexibility. No exact recipe, just resourcefulness. It was topped with breadcrumbs, sometimes mixed with saved bacon grease, and baked until golden and bubbling. Even the smell brought hope to the table. Churches often made huge trays of it to serve entire congregations. Some even held weekly community meals during the darkest years of the Depression, where one casserole could feed dozens. For many families, this was their only hot meal that week. These casseroles weren't just about filling stomachs. They were about pulling together as a community and proving that even in hard times, love and a little food could go a long way. And today, the tradition lives on. Sure, modern casseroles might have more cheese or fancier toppings, but the spirit is still the same, making the most out of what you have and sharing it with those around you. Egg drop soup. Egg drop soup may be simple, but during the Great Depression, it was nothing short of a lifesaver. At a time when meat was a luxury few could afford, eggs, especially for families who kept chickens, became one of the few affordable sources of protein. In small church kitchens, especially in rural towns and immigrant neighborhoods, this light, nourishing soup became a go-to meal that stretched every ingredient to its limit. Inspired by traditional Chinese cooking, the Women's Guild of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chicago adapted the recipe to suit Depression-era homes. It needed only 3 things: homemade chicken broth, often made from bones or scraps, a few eggs, and, if available, a pinch of green onions or cornstarch to thicken it. But the magic came in the method. Beaten eggs were slowly poured into the hot broth, forming silky ribbons that gave the soup both body and beauty. This dish wasn't just for the dinner table. Churches often used it in cooking demonstrations to teach struggling families how to feed a household on next to nothing. One priest in Philadelphia even said, "With this soup, a family of 4 can get their protein for pennies a day." It was warm, it was filling, and best of all, it gave families dignity, something hot and homemade that felt like more than survival. Paired with a slice of bread, egg drop soup became a full meal, proof that even in the hardest times, simplicity and creativity could bring comfort. Tomato soup cake. Tomato soup in a cake? It might sound strange today, but during the Great Depression, it was pure genius. In a time when fresh fruit and fancy baking ingredients were too expensive for most families, home cooks had to get creative. And that's how this unusual dessert was born. Canned tomato soup, believe it or not, became the secret weapon in many church kitchens. It added moisture, a little tang, and helped stretch what little ingredients were available. One famous version came from the Methodist Women's Circle of Lansing, Michigan. In their 1936 cookbook, they proudly wrote that no one could even guess the secret ingredient. And they were right. The soup was mixed with flour, sugar, a bit of lard or oil, and warm spices like cinnamon and cloves, creating a soft, spiced cake that felt special, even in the hardest of times. This cake became a hit at church bake sales. When frosting was available, it was topped with cream cheese, but even a sprinkle of saved sugar made it feel like a treat. And the best part? Campbell's tomato soup was cheap, easy to store, and didn't spoil, making it a Depression-era kitchen essential. For many kids, this was their first taste of vegetable dessert, and they loved it, none the wiser to what was hidden in the batter. It's a reminder of just how far a can of soup and a little hope could go. In the heart of the Great Depression, this clever recipe turned something simple into something sweet, and that's why it still lives on today. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Creamed chipped beef on toast may not sound glamorous, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver on a plate. You might have heard soldiers call it by a less polite name, but in church halls and family kitchens, it was known simply as a filling, affordable way to get protein on the table. The Lutheran Aid Society of Milwaukee included the recipe in their 1934 community cookbook, proudly calling it satisfying fare for hungry families. And they weren't wrong. It was made with dried beef, cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to store, mixed into a creamy white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk. Poured over slices of homemade toast, it became a warm, hearty meal that could stretch a little meat a long way. Church kitchens loved it because they could make huge trays at once, especially for men's prayer breakfasts or evening meals for struggling families. And out in the countryside, where families often still had a milk cow, it became a smart way to turn basic farm ingredients into something that tasted comforting, even luxurious by Depression standards. This dish was more than just food. It was proof that even in the hardest times, you didn't need fancy ingredients to feed people well. Creamed chipped beef on toast remains a proud reminder of the resourcefulness, creativity, and community spirit that helped Americans through the Great Depression. Corn chowder. During the Great Depression, few dishes brought people together like corn chowder. It was simple, warm, and filling, and in small rural churches, it was often the star of the table. Back then, every spoonful mattered. Food wasn't just about taste, it was about stretching what little you had to feed as many people as possible. In the countryside, families who had a patch of land grew their own corn and saved it for the hard winter months. The Women's Fellowship of the Congregational Church in rural Iowa shared a corn chowder recipe in 1933 that became a favorite. They said, "A little salt pork and some corn can warm both body and spirit in winter's darkest days." And they were right. Their version mixed whatever corn was on hand, fresh, canned, or dried and soaked, with chopped potatoes, onions, and just a bit of salt pork if it was available. It all simmered together in water, and if someone was lucky enough to have milk, a splash at the end made it extra creamy. Church suppers during those years often relied on this one-pot wonder. It was cheap, easy, and could feed a crowd. Biscuits or cornbread on the side turned it into a full meal, and when milk or meat was hard to find, they just left it out. No one complained. The soup still filled bellies and lifted spirits. Corn chowder wasn't fancy, but it was full of love. It's one of those Great Depression recipes that reminds us how strong people were and how even the smallest harvest could become something big enough to share. Bread pudding. Bread pudding might just be the sweetest example of survival during the Great Depression. In a time when nothing could be wasted, not even a crust of bread, this dessert turned stale scraps into something warm, filling, and comforting. Families couldn't afford to throw anything away, especially bread, which often came from church food programs or neighbors sharing what little they had. Church kitchens made this dish a staple. The Women of Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, included a version in their 1932 cookbook, calling it "the alchemy that turns yesterday's bread into today's comfort." And that's exactly what it was. A little milk, sugar, cinnamon, maybe an egg or applesauce, and some raisins if you were lucky. Everything went into one pan, soaked and baked until soft, sweet, and golden. At church gatherings, especially after communion, large trays of bread pudding were set out to make use of every leftover piece of bread. It could be made ahead of time, served warm or cold, and was always welcomed with a smile. It didn't matter if it came from a food line. Once baked, it felt like a homemade treat. What made bread pudding so powerful during the Great Depression was its message. You don't need much to make something meaningful. Even the hardest crust could be softened, sweetened, and shared. That spirit of making the most of what you have, that's what carried families through the hardest of times. Chow relish. In the heart of the Great Depression, flavor wasn't just rare, it was sacred. When meat was a memory and meals were more survival than celebration, something as small as a spoonful of chow relish could change everything. Tangy, vibrant, and full of crunch, this humble vegetable pickle didn't just sit on the side of the plate, it lifted it. It turned beans into something brighter, gave day-old cornbread new life, and made yet another week of pantry meals feel just a little less heavy. But chow wasn't just a condiment, it was a lifeline in a jar. Born from scraps, cabbage that had gone a little soft, green tomatoes that never ripened, cucumbers just past their peak, it was the epitome of resourcefulness. Everything that couldn't be eaten fresh was chopped, seasoned, and preserved with vinegar, sugar, and spices, capturing the last warmth of summer to carry families through the coldest stretch of the year. In southern towns, chow became more than just food. It became ritual. Churches, especially Baptist congregations, made it a community tradition. The Baptist Women's Missionary Union helped spread the recipe far and wide, and in 1935, the First Baptist Church of Charlotte, North Carolina, published what would become one of the most beloved versions in their community cookbook. Their blend? Cabbage, green tomatoes, sweet onions, peppers, cucumbers, steeped in a sharp golden brine flecked with turmeric and mustard seed. Every autumn, church basements and home kitchens came alive. Women gathered in aprons and rolled up sleeves, forming canning circles that were as much about connection as they were about cooking. Laughter filled the air alongside the steam from boiling jars. Hands chopped and stirred while voices shared prayers, stories, and news from neighbors. These weren't just food prep sessions, they were lifelines of their own. Bonds were sealed over bubbling pots and vinegar-scented air, and the jars they packed were more than just preserves. They were promises of nourishment, of care, of survival. When winter came and ingredients ran low, chow reminded people that joy could still exist at the dinner table. One spoonful was enough to wake up a pot of beans or dress up a slice of bread. It wasn't just about taste, it was about pride. We made this. We saved it. We'll get through. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing. During the Great Depression, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable, it was a lifeline. It was cheap, easy to store, and full of nutrition, which made it a hero in kitchens where every meal had to stretch. But thanks to church communities, especially the German Lutherans in Pennsylvania and the Midwest, cabbage also became something more: comforting, delicious, and even a little bit fancy. In 1933, St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne shared a recipe that quickly made its way across dinner tables and potluck gatherings. The idea was simple, but clever. Shred fresh cabbage and pour a warm dressing over it made from bacon drippings, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a beaten egg for richness. The hot dressing slightly wilted the cabbage, softening it just enough while keeping a bit of crunch. It was usually served in the colder months when cabbage was one of the few fresh vegetables families could still afford. And though bacon was expensive, just a small spoonful of saved drippings was enough to give the dish that rich, smoky flavor. Families gathered in church halls, the smell of bacon and vinegar in the air, and for a moment, a plate of cabbage felt like a feast. It wasn't just about feeding people, it was about lifting spirits during some of America's hardest times. That's what made this dish so special. It showed the Great Depression spirit at its best, turning simple food into something memorable, using every bit of what you had and sharing it with the people around you. Milk toast. During the Great Depression, comfort was rare, but milk toast brought it back to the table in the simplest, gentlest way. In a world where coins were counted, pantries were bare, and energy was saved for the essentials, milk toast stood out as a quiet act of care. It didn't require much, just a slice of bread, toasted golden, a knob of butter if you had it, and warm milk poured over the top like a lullaby for the stomach. To some today, it might sound plain, but to those who lived through those lean years, milk toast wasn't just food, it was kindness in a bowl. A sprinkle of salt, sugar, or cinnamon added a personal touch, a little sweetness when there was so little else to sweeten life. It was the kind of dish churches recommended for the sick, the elderly, and young children, soft on the stomach, warm on the soul. The Women's Christian Temperance Union once called it a dish that could sustain body and spirit when nothing else can be afforded. And they were right. In towns across America, church volunteers would carry steaming bowls of milk toast to shut-ins, widows, and recovering neighbors. It wasn't just nourishment, it was a reminder that someone cared, that someone remembered, that no one should feel forgotten in their hardest hour. If your family had a cow, you had milk, and if you had flour, you had bread. Together, they became more than the sum of their parts. They became a meal that held people together when the world felt like it was falling apart. Milk toast is a symbol of an era defined by resourcefulness and heart, a time when families didn't just survive on what they had, they gave it meaning. In every bowl was love, sacrifice, and resilience. Today, it may be overlooked, but behind its simplicity lies a legacy, a quiet reminder that even the most modest meals can carry the deepest weight when made with care and shared with love. Potato pancakes. Imagine turning just 3 potatoes into a full meal for a hungry family of 4. That's exactly what many did during the Great Depression, when every bite counted and waste wasn't an option. Potato pancakes were a quiet hero in kitchens across America, especially in church communities where neighbors leaned on each other and shared what little they had. This dish wasn't fancy, but it was deeply loved. In 1934, the Ladies' Aid Society of St. John's Lutheran Church in Wisconsin shared their German-inspired recipe. Grate raw potatoes, mix them with a bit of flour, an egg if you had one, or just water if you didn't, and stir in some chopped onions. Then fry it in leftover bacon grease or saved fat until golden and crispy. These golden pancakes showed up at countless church suppers, especially in communities with Eastern European and German roots. On Fridays, when Catholic families avoided meat, they offered a tasty, affordable alternative to fish. What made them truly special during the Great Depression was their power to fill bellies using just one main ingredient. Even plain, they were delicious. Add a spoonful of applesauce or a dollop of sour cream, if you were lucky, and it became a meal people looked forward to. The crispy edges, the rich flavor, it felt like comfort, like home, in a time when comfort was hard to come by. This simple recipe, born from necessity, reminds us that great food doesn't always come from abundance. Sometimes it's the result of love, patience, and 3 humble potatoes. Mock apple pie. Picture biting down on a wedge of apple pie, flaky crust, sweetened with care, and spices blended to a perfect balance, without a single apple. That is the magic of mock apple pie, perhaps the greatest culinary trick born of the Great Depression. When fresh fruit was out of the budget for most households, then people had to be resourceful. And that is precisely what church communities did. During those trying years, the families still longed for a flavor of something familiar, something which would remind them of happier times. And so, when apples weren't available, they used crackers. Yes, Ritz crackers. Presbyterian Women's Circle of Topeka, Kansas, made the now famous recipe in 1932, saying with pride, "None will guess the secret ingredient." And indeed, no one did. It begins with a standard crust, followed by a filling of crushed crackers soaked in a sweet syrup made from water, cream of tartar, a dash of lemon juice, and a lot of sugar. Something magical occurs when it is in the oven. Those crushed crackers soften and soak up the syrup to become a filling whose flavor is remarkably like that of apples. Church bakes' sales adored this pie. They didn't even say it was made with crackers most of the time. Folks would grin, take a bite, and be stunned when discovering the truth. The recipe got so popular that Ritz started putting it on their boxes by 1934. But there was more to this than just a preference. Mock apple pie allowed for a sense of normalcy, a means of enjoying one of America's favorite desserts, even when apples themselves were out of the realm of possibility. It nourished not just the belly, but the heart. It was a rare moment of joy amidst the Great Depression. But a serving of this pie, passed at a church picnic or a dinner with the family, reminded all that even in tough times, comfort and creativity can abound. Bean patties. Imagine craving a burger during the Great Depression, when meat was nearly impossible to afford. That's where bean patties stepped in. These humble creations became lifesavers in church kitchens across America, offering a hearty, protein-packed meal without a single slice of meat. When times were tough, and wallets even tighter, families had to get creative, and this dish was a perfect example of turning the ordinary into something comforting. Church communities led the charge in sharing this meatless miracle. One well-known version came from the Missionary Society of the First Methodist Church in Chicago, published in their 1933 economy cookbook. Their recipe called for mashed navy beans, a bit of chopped onion, breadcrumbs, and a few pantry spices, all mixed, shaped into patties, and fried until golden and crisp. They looked like burgers, they tasted like home, and most importantly, they filled stomachs when there wasn't much else to offer. Church kitchens would make these by the dozens for community meals, especially in working-class neighborhoods where meat had become a rare luxury. A ladle of simple tomato sauce or gravy on top added moisture and made the dish feel more complete. And though they were born from hard times, bean patties became beloved for how satisfying they were, both in taste and in nutrition. During the Great Depression, meals like this didn't just feed families, they gave them hope. Proof that even when meat was off the table, dignity and nourishment didn't have to be. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush may sound plain, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifeline. When bread was a luxury and meat was rare, this humble porridge kept bellies full from sunrise to sunset. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, making it a staple for families struggling to survive the toughest economic times in American history. In church basements and community halls, bags of cornmeal were handed out like gold. Relief programs made sure that even when shelves were bare, no one had to go without a warm meal. A rural Methodist preacher who rode between small country churches handed out recipe cards in 1932 calling cornmeal mush the staff of life when wheat bread cannot be afforded. And he meant it. The recipe was beautifully simple: cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt. For breakfast, families stirred in milk and sugar, if they had any. For dinner, they cooled the mush, sliced it, and fried it with a bit of fat or onion. Some added beans, others paired it with wild greens. Church ladies even held cooking demos to show neighbors all the different ways to stretch a single bag of cornmeal. The beauty of cornmeal mush wasn't just its taste or its cost, it was its heart. It filled plates, quieted hunger, and brought comfort when hope was running low. It was a dish that said, "We're going to get through this." And for countless Americans during the Great Depression, that message meant everything. Pintos and cornbread. During the Great Depression, pintos and cornbread weren't just a meal, they were a lifesaver. Cheap, easy to make, and surprisingly filling, this simple combo became the go-to dinner for struggling families across the South and Southwest. In a time when money was tight and every bite mattered, this dish showed up on kitchen tables and in church fellowship halls alike. Churches became the heart of the community, and food was their way of giving hope. In 1934, the Baptist Women's Missionary Union of Oklahoma published a recipe book that described it perfectly. A pot of beans and a pan of cornbread can satisfy a family for pennies a day. And they meant it. The beans were cooked slow, seasoned with just salt, and if you were lucky, a small piece of salt pork. The cornbread was even simpler: cornmeal, salt, water, and maybe a little bacon fat or lard. No fancy ingredients, just what people had. But together, they made a meal that could warm the belly and lift the spirit. Many churches hosted beans and cornbread nights to feed the hungry or raise money, serving plates for just a few cents. It wasn't just about food, it was about coming together when times were tough. And nutritionally, this humble pair was powerful. Pintos gave families protein and fiber. Cornbread added the carbs and nutrients they needed. It was a full meal with no extras required. Even today, people still crave Pintos and cornbread, not because they have to, but because it reminds them of strength, community, and how simple food got America through the hardest days of the Great Depression. Onion sandwiches. They sound strange today, but during the Great Depression, they were a lunchtime lifesaver. At a time when meat and cheese were far too expensive, families had to get creative with whatever they had on hand, and onions, cheap, easy to grow, and full of flavor, became the star of many meals. Church cookbooks across the country offered this simple but clever recipe. Slice sweet onions thin, soak them in cold water to soften the sharp bite, and layer them between 2 slices of buttered bread. If butter was too pricey, a bit of bacon grease or lard worked just as well. One 1932 pamphlet from the United Methodist Women in rural Georgia, titled "Feeding Families in Hard Times," shared this exact recipe. It wasn't fancy, but it filled stomachs and stretched tight budgets. In early spring, when storage onions were running low and fresh vegetables were still weeks away, these sandwiches made a comeback at church picnics and home kitchens alike. Kids would even head out to the fields to gather wild greens like chickweed to toss into the sandwiches, adding nutrition and a little variety. What made onion sandwiches so special wasn't just their simplicity, it was how they turned almost nothing into something comforting. In the heart of the Great Depression, when every meal was a struggle, even a sandwich made of onions could taste like hope. Mayonnaise cake. Mayonnaise in chocolate cake? It sounds like a kitchen mistake, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicious solution. When eggs and butter disappeared from grocery shelves or simply became too expensive to buy, families had to get creative. And in church kitchens across the country, that creativity led to something magical. Mayonnaise cake. Yes, mayonnaise, because it's made with eggs and oil, stepped in as the unlikely hero of baking. The Women's Circle at First Christian Church in Des Moines called it their miracle cake, and their 1935 fundraiser cookbook proudly declared, "None will believe it begins with mayonnaise." With just flour, sugar, cocoa powder, water, and mayo, they created a moist, rich chocolate cake that wowed both kids and adults. Church bake sales loved it. Sunday schools served it at every birthday, and community celebrations were never complete without a slice. For families struggling through the Great Depression, this cake meant more than dessert. It meant a chance to celebrate, to smile, to feel normal, if only for a moment. It turned a sandwich spread into a secret weapon of joy. Even today, mayonnaise cake reminds us how powerful simple ingredients can be when used with a little faith and a lot of heart. Because in the toughest times, a sweet slice of chocolate cake, no matter how it's made, can taste like hope. These 25 Great Depression church recipes aren't just old cookbooks come to life. They are powerful reminders of a time when Americans relied on community, faith, and sheer creativity to survive. When the markets crashed and jobs disappeared, it was the humble kitchens of churches that kept hope alive, one pot at a time. Each dish we shared today tells a story, not just of hunger, but of heart. Of neighbors swapping recipes in church basements, of mothers making a pie out of water just to give their kids something sweet, of potlucks where every family brought what they could, no matter how small. These meals weren't just about staying full, they were about staying together. In every ladle of potato soup, every slice of vinegar pie, and every bite of bean patties, you can taste the resilience and love of a generation that refused to give up. They didn't have much, but they had enough, and they made it work with grace, grit, and a little help from their church community. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all, that good food doesn't come from fancy ingredients or expensive stores. It comes from tradition, togetherness, and the determination to make something out of nothing. These recipes deserve a place in our modern kitchens, not just because they're frugal or simple, but because they connect us to the people who came before us. They teach us how to waste less, cook with more intention, and appreciate what we have. So, if you enjoyed this trip through America's culinary past and want to learn more about the meals that shaped generations, please give this video a like. Subscribe to our channel, The America We Remember, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next time we bring history back to the dinner table. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your family's Depression-era recipes or stories in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going and make sure these beautiful traditions aren't forgotten. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep cooking, keep remembering, and keep passing it on.